Well, good morning, First Church, and happy Ascension Sunday to each of you. As we begin to ponder for a few moments this morning what Ascension Sunday means for us and why it is we might celebrate on this day, well, I would like to invite you to imagine this scene. It's November 4, 2008, election night in the United States of America. And at Washington, D.C.'s Howard University, one of America's first historically black colleges and universities. At that university, hundreds, if not thousands, of African American college students are crammed into an auditorium. They're there because they're waiting for election results. And they are excited. These students, some of them are so full of nervous energy that they just kind of bounce up and down wherever they are standing. Others, a little bit more intentional, they dance to the music that's pounding over the loudspeakers. Still others chant their favorite political slogans. I mean, the air is just thick with excitement and with anticipation. And then the big moment comes. The moment when the election is called and it is declared that a young African American senator from Illinois, a man named Barack Obama, is going to be the 44th president of the United States. In that moment, as soon as that announcement is made, a mighty roar erupts from this crowd of students. And then they begin to weep, they begin to whoop, they begin to collapse into each other's arms as this great tidal wave of emotion and joy sweeps over them. If you happen to look up that moment yourself on YouTube a little later, I think that you'll agree, no matter what your politics are, that is an incredibly powerful human moment. But if you watch that video for yourself a little later, I think you might also find yourself wondering, as I wondered this week, why it was that these young students were so incredibly excited about the election of Barack Obama. I mean, I remember that election. I had friends who were pleased that President Obama won the election. But these friends who, happen to look a little bit more like me than they do those students at Howard University, well, these friends, though they were pleased, they weren't quite that pleased. So what was it about this experience that was different for those young African American college students? Obviously, I can't say for sure, but I've got a hunch. I imagine that this experience was different for those students, at least in part. Well, I imagine that they were excited, at least in part, because those students could look at their new leader and president, one of the most powerful men in the world. They could look at him and they could say, that man, right? This man who has just been elected president and is going to walk into the halls of power. This man understands what it is like to be us. Right? This man gets us. This man knows us. This man understands us. I imagine that some of those students might have even thought to themselves, this man who is going to be one of the most powerful men in the world, this man we can trust and we can know he's looking out for us because this man is one of us. Well, if you can understand at least a little bit where those students are coming from, how they might have thought that, I think that you are on your way to understanding why it is that we celebrate the Ascension of Jesus today. And let's just pause and let's acknowledge that it is kind of a strange thing to celebrate, isn't it? At least at first glance. I mean, it makes sense that we celebrate, as we do every Christmas, Jesus coming down to earth to live with us and to walk among us. I mean, it makes sense to celebrate his coming, but why do we celebrate Jesus leaving earth and to go and live with his Father? I mean, wouldn't it be better for everybody if Jesus had stuck around a little longer? I mean, wouldn't it be especially great now if Jesus were here in this time to help us navigate this crisis? I mean, forget worrying about finding PPE and ventilators. We could just have Jesus jet around the globe and pronounce healing over entire hospitals and maybe even over entire cities. COVID be gone. And why would we worry about government stimulus packages and meat shortages in the grocery store? We could just ask Jesus to show up in the neediest places of this world, give him a few pieces of bread, maybe a little extra meatloaf, and have Jesus feed everyone for us. I mean, there's no telling what kind of ministry Jesus might continue to do if he were still here, still walking around this earth. But I think it's natural for all of us to assume that things would be better if he were still here. Right? That things would be better if Jesus were here, especially in this time of crisis. And yet, the church has long insisted that it's actually better that Jesus has left. Especially during times of crisis. In fact, I learned this week, or was reminded this week, that it's actually, throughout the history of the church, it's actually during these kinds of moments of crisis that the church has tended to pay more attention to the ascension than they usually do. For example, people who count these things, who pay attention to these things, they tell me that in the weeks and months after 9/11, well, more churches talked and preached and sang about the ascension than they had in months and years prior. And if you go back a few decades before that, you discover that a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran pastor, writing from his Nazi prison cell, well, Bonhoeffer declared in that time and in that circumstance that the ascension, right, Ascension Day, he said, is the day of all days for Christians to celebrate. If you were to go back further, I'm sure you could find other examples too, but the point I want to make to you today is that throughout the history of the church, God's people have insisted that the ascended Jesus is not actually less helpful to us in times of crisis. He's actually more helpful. Part of the reason for that, of course, is, well, many of you have probably already guessed, part of the reason for that is part of what the ascension declares is that Jesus is king. Right? The ascension into heaven, this is Jesus' coronation ceremony. This is when he is crowned King of Kings and Lord of Lords, when it is declared that he now sits at the right hand of the Father, far above, as Ephesians says, far above every ruler, every power, every dominion, every authority, every name that might be named in heaven and on earth. He is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But that's not the only reason that we celebrate the ascension in times of crisis. That's the start of it. But there's more. You see, we don't just celebrate the ascension in times of crisis because Jesus is king. We celebrate the ascension because Jesus is king, and Jesus, the king, is one of us. Now, during normal times, most Sunday mornings after our worship service, I have the privilege of gathering together with some of our high school students, our 11th and 12th graders, for their Sunday school class. That happens most Sundays throughout the year. We'll trot over to the Emerson house after the service, and the kids will start by having a little snack. Inevitably, someone goes and borrows a few Rice Krispie treats from the kitchen, or maybe some goldfish crackers from the nursery. So the kids will start with their snack, and many days I'll start by asking the kids a question. Well, a while back, I asked my 11th and 12th graders this question. I said, what happened to Jesus' body after he rose again and ascended into heaven? I mean, where is Jesus' body now? Right? What became of it? Believe when I asked that question, my response I got was probably, well, it was pretty similar to the response I often get, and the response, in fact, many of you might be giving me right now. I believe the response I got was a lot of silence and more than a few blank looks. Because apparently these students had never really given much thought to what happened to Jesus' body. And of course, I can't blame them for that, because the truth is that's something I never really thought about either. Until a few years ago, I stumbled across a rather prominent theologian who observed that when Jesus ascended into heaven, his resurrected body didn't just vaporize into thin air and vanish, as I guess I had always kind of assumed it had. But no, this theologian wrote that when Jesus went into the presence of the Father, it's not as though he shed his humanity like a cicada shell. It's not as though he stripped off his resurrection body like you might strip off a pair of poorly fitting blue jeans. He said, it's not like Jesus got to the Father's right hand and he said, oh boy, I'm sure glad that's over. I'm sure glad I don't have to be a human being anymore. I'm glad I can get back to being just God now. No. When Jesus entered the presence of the Father, he entered with his resurrection body. Right? Jesus, in other words, still has that body. Jesus still has two pinky toes and kneecaps and that funny little skin on your elbow that's always too loose. So when Jesus went to the Father's right hand, Jesus took his humanity. And indeed, not just his humanity, but Jesus took our humanity with him. Because Jesus is still our flesh and blood. He is still, as the writer of Hebrews says, our brother. In other words, the ascended Jesus is still one of us. And friends, I think that is powerfully good news. I think that is good news that really changes everything. I mean, think about this. How do we know that God will hear our prayers? How can we trust that he knows our needs and indeed is eager to meet our needs? Well, it's because Jesus, our advocate, is one of us. And how can we know that our God and Father will not abandon us or forsake us, that he will not neglect us or forget about us? Well, it's because Jesus, his Son, is one of us. I mean, Jesus, his Son, has taken our humanity with him and has now been enfolded into the reality of the triune God. And so God can no longer forsake our humanity without forsaking himself. Because Jesus is one of us. And how can we know that there is a place prepared for us? How can we know that there is a home in heaven for us? How can we know that someday, when our time here on this earth is done, we will be welcomed into the presence of the Father forever? Well, it's because Jesus, our Savior and friend who has gone ahead of us, and been welcomed ahead of us. Well, Jesus is one of us. And how can we know that God is still working for our good, even in the midst of trouble and hardship? How can we be assured that he is still eager to help us in times of difficulty? How can we be confident that our God is indeed for us and not against us? Well, it's because Jesus, our risen and ascended King, is one of us. Some years ago, James Scott wrote a short story where it tells about a couple of empty nesters named Romy and Rosalie. And the story opens, Romy and Rosalie are having an argument. It's a Thursday night, and Romy and Rosalie are arguing about whether or not they should go to their church's Ascension Day service, because as some of you remember, those are things churches used to have 40 days after Easter. They would have Ascension Day worship services. But they were never popular, and they weren't particularly popular with Romy. He didn't want to go. So Romy, he just kind of figured, his wife, she only wanted to go because their daughter, their adult daughter, was on a road trip with her friends somewhere halfway across the country, and his wife, Rosalie, was feeling nervous about that. So she just wanted to go to church to make herself feel better. But Romy didn't want to do that. He wanted to stay home and just have a nice, relaxing night at home, watch the news, maybe a little Wheel of Fortune, and go to bed early. In the end, Rosalie decided it wasn't worth the argument. She was going to let Romy have his way. So she left to go get ready for church. And Romy settled into his recliner. He clutched the remote. He turned on the local news. And at first, Romy was pretty content with that arrangement. Kind of settled in there. And that seemed good. But then a few minutes later, a news story came on about a 20-car pileup that had happened in Nebraska a few weeks before. And as that story unfolded, well, it seemed to hit Romy. It hit him that could have been his daughter in that accident or in some accident like it. And from there, his imagination just began to run. He pictured himself cresting a hill near his home in his old pickup truck, and spotting his daughter's little red Toyota in the ditch, surrounded by emergency vehicles and flashing lights. He pictured that, and then he began to picture and to imagine so many of the other terrible things that might happen to one of his children, to one of the people that he loved. And as he imagined that, tears began to fill his eyes. And then Jim Scott finishes the story this way. He writes this. And then Rosalie was back, standing in the doorway, half a smile on her face. I know what you're thinking. I'm a worrywart, she said, her voice trailing off. Then she looked at the floor. She pulled her arms into her sweater, began again. But it's Ascension Day, Romy. Ascension Day. And he's not just born like at Christmas. And he's not just died like Good Friday. And he's not just been raised again like on Easter. She picked up her purse, straightened her shoulders, and she went on. He's on high. He's on the throne, honey. And he's the king. At that, writes James Scott, Romy smiled and got to his feet to join his wife for worship. Because, of course, she was right. Friends, she was right. And that is the beginning of the good news for us today. He is the king. But he's not just the king. He's the king, and he's one of us. Dear friends, I hope and pray that good news fills you with joy and with peace and with hope today and in this week as you seek to follow him, as you navigate your way through this strange and crazy world. He's the king, and he's one of us. Grace and peace to you, dear friends. Have a good week.